At 5:58 in the morning local time on Saturday, August 15th, 2026, the ground beneath the Flores Sea in eastern Indonesia ruptured. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake, one of the strongest recorded anywhere on Earth so far this year, struck roughly 68 kilometers northwest of the city of Enda on Flores Island at a shallow depth of just 10 kilometers. Within minutes, Indonesia's meteorological agency issued a tsunami warning for 4 provinces. Hospitals evacuated patients into the streets. Thousands of people ran for higher ground, and in the hours that followed, the earthquake didn't stop. A magnitude 6.9 aftershock struck the same region just hours later, a 6.1, a 5.9, a 5.6. Dozens of aftershocks in total, rattling an island that was already reeling from the main shock. As of the most recent count, at least 47 people are confirmed dead, with more injured and at least 2 people still reported missing. Rescue teams have not yet been able to reach Nagakeo, the region closest to the epicenter, because landslides have blocked the roads and disrupted communications. This is happening right now, less than 24 hours old as we're putting this together, and the numbers are almost certainly going to change before this video is even finished being watched by everyone who sees it. Today we're going to walk through exactly what happened in Flores, why this particular stretch of Indonesia has such a violent, well-documented history with earthquakes and tsunamis, why the tsunami warning was issued and then lifted, what the science tells us about the specific fault system responsible, and why Indonesia, more than almost any other country on Earth, lives with this risk as a permanent, unavoidable feature of daily life. No exaggeration beyond what's already true. No dramatizing beyond the real numbers. Just what we actually know, as of right now. Before we get into it, if you have any connection to Indonesia, family there, friends there, or you've traveled through the region, drop a comment and let us know. And if you've ever experienced an earthquake and tsunami warning issued in the same morning, I'd genuinely like to hear what that felt like. Because I don't think most people watching this have ever lived through both at once. If you want to stay ahead of every major seismic story as it develops, subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps us keep covering these events quickly and accurately. A thumbs up helps too. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches people who need real information right now instead of a recycled panic clip. All right, let's get into it. The earthquake struck at 5:58 a.m. Central Indonesia time, with its epicenter located off the northern coast of East Nusa Tenggara province, roughly 42 miles northwest of Enda, a coastal city on Flores Island. The United States Geological Survey placed the depth at just 10 kilometers, which, if you've been following our earlier coverage of Venezuela's earthquake sequence earlier this year, you already know is dangerously shallow. At that depth, almost none of the seismic energy gets absorbed by the rock between the rupture and the surface, meaning the full force of a magnitude 7.7 rupture hit the surface with close to maximum intensity. The shaking was felt across much of Flores Island, and initial reports coming out in the hours immediately after described heavy damage. Footage from local television showed hospital staff evacuating patients as a precaution, moving beds, IV stands, and oxygen cylinders out into the open, and setting up temporary treatment areas. Outdoors. A resident of Sika Regency described the scene in stark terms, saying a number of buildings had been damaged by the strong shaking, with panicked people running toward higher ground, and that the waiting room at the port terminal in Maumere had collapsed entirely. In East Manggarai province, residents were photographed examining the wreckage of homes reduced to rubble. Indonesia's Meteorology, Climatology, and Geophysics Agency, known by its Indonesian acronym BMKG, issued an early tsunami warning covering parts of West Nusa Tenggara, East Nusa Tenggara, South Sulawesi, and Southeast Sulawesi provinces, urging coastal residents to move immediately to higher ground and stay away from beaches and riverbanks. That warning triggered exactly the kind of scene we've described in previous earthquake coverage. Thousands of people, woken before dawn by violent shaking, now moving quickly and fearfully away from the coastline, based on the very real possibility that a wall of water could follow within minutes. The main shock was followed almost immediately by a dense sequence of aftershocks. Within roughly 30 minutes of the initial rupture, USGS data recorded a magnitude 5.9 at 22:13 UTC, a magnitude 5.6 at 22:18 UTC, and a magnitude 6.1 at 22:28 UTC, all striking the same general area. Hours later, a magnitude 6.9 aftershock hit, itself powerful enough to be a significant damaging earthquake in its own right under different circumstances, now compounding the destruction and terror already inflicted by the main shock. A magnitude 7.0 aftershock was also recorded, striking further west, near Ruteng. Authorities confirmed dozens of aftershocks rattled the island throughout the day, the strongest reaching magnitude 6.1 by some measurements, 6.9 by others depending on the specific event being referenced, an ongoing rolling sequence that kept the entire region on edge for hours after the initial rupture. Here's a detail that matters enormously for understanding how this specific disaster unfolded, and it's a genuinely important piece of the story that got less attention than the initial panic. After issuing the tsunami warning and urging coastal evacuation, Indonesian authorities monitored actual sea level data in the hours that followed and found no significant changes that would pose a real threat to coastal communities. The warning was subsequently lifted. This is worth explaining clearly because it's exactly the kind of nuance that separates responsible earthquake reporting from panic content. A tsunami warning being issued is not the same thing as a tsunami actually occurring. It's a precautionary measure issued rapidly based on the earthquake's magnitude, depth, and location, all factors that make a tsunami plausible, before agencies have had time to confirm what's actually happening with sea levels in real time. In this case, despite the earthquake's shallow depth and significant magnitude, the actual seafloor displacement wasn't sufficient to generate a damaging tsunami wave, and BMKG's monitoring equipment was able to confirm that within a relatively short window and stand the warning down. This doesn't mean the warning was a false alarm in any meaningful sense, or that issuing it was the wrong call. Given the historical precedent in this exact region, which we'll get to in a moment, and given how little advance notice a genuine tsunami would give coastal residents if one had developed, issuing the warning immediately and evacuating people to higher ground was the correct, responsible decision. Exactly the kind of erring on the side of caution approach that saves lives, when the alternative, in some other version of this event, could have been catastrophic. The warning being lifted after monitoring confirmed no significant wave activity as the system working as intended, not evidence that the initial alarm was overblown. If the name Flores sounds familiar in the context of earthquake and tsunami disasters, there's a specific, well-documented reason for that, and Indonesian officials referenced it directly in their response to this week's earthquake. In December 1992, an earthquake struck this same general area with similar intensity. The shaking and the tsunami that followed killed more than 2,500 people, one of the deadliest combined earthquake-tsunami disasters in Indonesia's modern history. BMKG explicitly cited that 1992 Flores earthquake as the most relevant prior event in this exact regional tectonic setting when responding to this week's magnitude 7.7, both because of the similar magnitude and because both events occurred along the same underlying source structure, something known as the Flores back-arc thrust. Understanding what a back-arc thrust actually is helps explain why this specific stretch of Indonesia produces earthquakes of this severity so consistently. Indonesia sits along an extraordinarily complex convergence of tectonic plates, part of the reason it's consistently ranked among the most seismically active countries on Earth. The Flores region specifically sits behind, or back from, the main subduction zone where the Australian plate dives beneath the Sunda plate further to the south, rather than the earthquake occurring directly on that main subduction interface. Back-arc thrust earthquakes occur on a separate, related system of faults that form behind the main subduction zone as a consequence of the broader compression happening across the region. These faults are capable of producing earthquakes just as large and just as dangerous as the main subduction interface itself, and because they tend to sit closer to populated coastlines than the main offshore subduction trench, their tsunamis can arrive with even less warning time. This isn't the only recent example of this exact hazard playing out in Indonesia. In 2018, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck the city of Palu on the island of Sulawesi, generating a large localized tsunami that devastated coastal areas. That same earthquake also triggered a phenomenon called liquefaction, where violently shaken, saturated soil temporarily behaves like a liquid, in this case turning entire neighborhoods in Palu into what witnesses described as rivers of sludge, burying homes and people in ground that had, moments earlier, been solid enough to build a city on. And further back, in December 2004, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the coast of Sumatra in western Indonesia triggered the Indian Ocean tsunami, one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded human history, killing over 230,000 people across more than a dozen countries. Indonesia is, quite simply, a country that has repeatedly experienced some of the worst earthquake and tsunami disasters in modern history, not because of bad luck, but because of where it sits on the planet. We've talked before about the Ring of Fire, the roughly 25,000-mile arc of tectonic activity circling the Pacific Ocean, responsible for the overwhelming majority of the world's earthquakes and active volcanoes. Indonesia doesn't just sit near this arc. In many respects, it sits at one of its most geologically complicated and active junctions anywhere on Earth. The Indonesian archipelago exists at the collision point of multiple major tectonic plates, the Eurasian plate, the Australian plate, the Pacific plate, and several smaller independently moving microplates squeezed between them. This is a fundamentally more complex tectonic environment than somewhere like Japan, which itself sits at the convergence of four plates, or California, which deals primarily with the interaction between two. Indonesia's specific geological situation, an archipelago of more than 17,000 islands sitting directly atop this collision zone, means earthquake risk isn't concentrated along one or two well-mapped fault lines the way it is in most of the disaster stories we've covered. It's distributed across dozens of active fault systems and subduction zones spanning thousands of miles of coastline, each capable of producing a magnitude 7+ earthquake essentially independently of the others. This is also, sobering as it is to say, why Indonesia has become one of the best studied countries on Earth when it comes to earthquake and tsunami hazard assessment, precisely because the country has been forced, repeatedly and tragically, to build that expertise in real time. Indonesian government geological analysis explicitly notes that the population in regions like Flores predominantly lives in structures that remain vulnerable to earthquake shaking, citing unreinforced brick construction with concrete floors and precast concrete frame buildings with vulnerable wall construction as the dominant building types across the affected area, though more resistant structures do exist alongside them. That combination, a genuinely dangerous, complex, tectonic environment layered on top of a large population living in structures that predate modern seismic engineering standards, is exactly the pattern we've seen determine outcomes in every major earthquake disaster we've covered this year. It's important to be honest about where things actually stand right now, because this disaster is genuinely still in its early hours, and the picture is going to keep changing. Rescue teams have confirmed they have not yet been able to reach Nagakeo, the region sitting closest to the earthquake's epicenter, because landslides triggered by the shaking have blocked roads and disrupted communications into the area. This is precisely the same pattern we've described in earlier disaster coverage, whether it was Chaco's remote jungle-isolated communities in Colombia's recent earthquake or Venezuela's overwhelmed morgues in June. The areas closest to an earthquake's epicenter are very often the hardest to reach, the least equipped to communicate what's actually happening on the ground, and therefore the slowest to have their full toll accurately counted. That's exactly why the current death toll, standing at 47 as of the most recent official update from Indonesia's National Disaster Management Agency, should be understood as a number that is very likely to rise, not a final accounting. Communications remain disrupted in the hardest hit areas closest to the epicenter, search and rescue access remains actively blocked by landslides, and the aftershock sequence, still ongoing with events as large as magnitude 6.9 and 7.0, continues to complicate both the safety of rescue workers and the structural stability of buildings that survived the main shock but sustained serious damage. It's worth placing this earthquake honestly alongside the other major seismic disasters we've covered together over the past several months, because the comparison tells us something real about how disparate the human toll of a similarly sized earthquake can be, depending entirely on where it strikes and how prepared the affected population and infrastructure happen to be. Venezuela's earthquake sequence in June at magnitude 7.2 and 7.5 struck an extremely shallow depth of around 10 kilometers, hit a country in the midst of prolonged economic collapse with severely degraded infrastructure and minimal earthquake early warning capacity, and resulted in a death toll that climbed into the thousands, with tens of thousands more reported missing. Colombia's magnitude 7.4 earthquake earlier this month struck at a meaningfully greater depth of roughly 103 kilometers, hit a country with functioning institutions and real, if imperfect, disaster response infrastructure, and has so far resulted in over 200 confirmed deaths with thousands still missing. This Indonesian earthquake, at magnitude 7.7, striking at an extremely shallow 10-kilometer depth, remarkably similar in both magnitude and depth to Venezuela's most destructive rupture, has so far resulted in a confirmed death toll of 47, a dramatically lower figure relative to the earthquake's raw physical intensity. Part of that difference almost certainly reflects the earthquake striking offshore in the Flores Sea, rather than directly beneath a densely populated capital city, the way Venezuela's rupture did beneath Caracas and La Guaira. But part of it also reflects something Indonesia has been forced to build, repeatedly and painfully, over decades of recurring seismic disaster, genuine institutional capacity for rapid tsunami warning issuance, established evacuation behavior among coastal populations who have lived through this exact scenario before, and disaster response infrastructure that, while still facing serious challenges reaching the most remote affected communities, was able to begin coordinated hospital evacuations and search and rescue operations within hours rather than days. None of this makes the loss any less real for the 47 families currently grieving, or any less urgent for the communities still waiting for rescue teams to reach them through landslide-blocked roads. But it's a genuine data-supported illustration of the same lesson that's run through every earthquake story we've told this year. The magnitude of an earthquake sets the ceiling on how bad a disaster can become. What actually determines the outcome every single time is the combination of geology, depth, population density at the epicenter, and decades of prior human decisions about building codes, warning systems, and disaster preparedness. Over the coming days, expect the confirmed death toll to continue rising as rescue teams reach Nagakeo and other isolated communities closer to the epicenter, and as landslide-blocked roads are cleared enough to allow both access and communication to be restored. Expect continued aftershock activity, since a magnitude 7.7 rupture of this kind typically produces aftershocks for weeks or even months afterward, gradually decreasing in both frequency and magnitude, but still capable of producing individually damaging events, exactly as we've already seen with this sequence's magnitude 6.9 and 7.0 aftershocks in the hours immediately following the main shock. Indonesia's National Disaster Management Agency will likely coordinate an expanding relief effort across the affected provinces, providing emergency shelter, medical care, and food assistance to displaced residents, while structural engineers begin assessing which of the damaged buildings across Flores and neighboring islands remain safe to occupy. Given Indonesia's history with earthquakes of this scale and the country's substantial accumulated institutional experience with disasters like this one, international assistance, if requested, would likely supplement rather than substitute for an already functioning domestic response framework, a meaningfully different starting position than what we saw play out in Venezuela earlier this year. Here's what's worth sitting with as we close this one out. Less than 24 hours ago, the ground beneath the Flores Sea ruptured in a magnitude 7.7 earthquake. Shallow, powerful, and eerily similar in scale to a disaster that struck this exact same region more than 3 decades ago and killed over 2,500 people. This time, as of right now, the confirmed toll stands at 47, with rescue teams still working to reach the hardest hit, most isolated communities closest to the epicenter, and aftershocks still rattling an island that hasn't had a full day to process what's already happened. This earthquake is not connected to Colombia's earthquake earlier this month, or Venezuela's catastrophic sequence back in June in any mechanical, tectonic sense. These are entirely separate fault systems on entirely separate tectonic boundaries, thousands of miles apart. What connects them is something we've said in nearly every one of these videos this year, and it remains true here. The Ring of Fire never stops. Indonesia sits at one of the most geologically complex and active points along that entire 25,000-mile arc, and this earthquake, devastating as it is not an aberration. It's a recurrence of exactly the kind of event this specific stretch of ocean has produced before in 1992, in 2004, in 2018, and now again this week. We'll be tracking this story closely as it continues to develop, the rising death toll, the ongoing aftershock sequence, and the rescue effort still working to reach Nagakeo and the other isolated communities closest to the epicenter. Subscribe so you don't miss any of those updates, and if you have any connection to Indonesia, or to Flores specifically, drop a comment. These numbers are always heavier than they look on a screen, and every one of them represents someone's family, someone's home, someone's ordinary Saturday morning that ended in a way nobody could have prepared for in time. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so this story reaches people who need accurate information right now. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.